Before I tell you a little bit about the findings for 2011, perhaps just a word about the context, because 2011 was the second year after the Lisbon Treaty had come into effect, but it was also obviously the second year of the Euro crisis. And this is very much the background to everything that Europe did in foreign policy in 2011. And we think that something happened, something quite important happened in 2011. In 2010, the first year of the crisis, it was a problem for Europe. In 2011, the second year of the crisis, it started to become a problem for the whole of the rest of the world. So you now have, for example, economists in China and in the US thinking not just about whether the euro is going to survive, but how to limit the turmoil that a collapse of the euro might cause for them. And in that sense, in 2011, something quite important happened, which is that, in a sense, Europe lost its agency. It's gone in some ways from being a solution to global problems to being a problem itself that has to be solved by others. And against that background, we think that that's had an impact on European foreign policy in 4 different ways. First of all, it's made the idea of Europe less powerful than it was before. So Europe's lost soft power. The model that it stood for, that the EU stands for, the model of regional integration, we think has lost some of its attractiveness to others around the world. There's been, in a sense, collateral damage from the euro crisis to the model for which the EU stands. That's quite difficult to measure, and we don't measure that systematically in the scorecard. But we think that's a worrying development. Intuitively, it does seem to be the case that Europe's lost soft power. Secondly, much more concrete terms, we think that the euro crisis constrained Europe's ability to respond to the Arab awakening. The revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa, probably the most important geopolitical event since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and the crisis meant that Europe was less able to respond effectively to it than it would have been otherwise. And I think Lluís is going to talk a bit more about the Arab awakening, but I'll come back to that as well myself. Thirdly, the crisis triggered a wave of budget cuts in most member states, not all member states, but most, particularly on defence and development aid. Some of the effects of this haven't yet been felt because those budget cuts haven't kicked in yet, but we think that's a worrying development for the future that will constrain Europe's foreign policy performance in the future. And fourthly, and perhaps most worryingly, we think that the crisis has led to what we call a renationalisation of European foreign policy. So there's been a re-emergence of intergovernmentalism in order to respond to the crisis, and you can debate whether that was necessary or not, but we also think that it's had a kind of a knock-on effect for European foreign policy, that in 2011, foreign policy was often made in a similar intergovernmental way, in particular through what Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, the former NATO Secretary-General, who's a member of our steering group, calls selective diplomacy, where big member states, in particular France and Germany, invite other member states into the room, but on a very much an ad hoc basis, and in the process marginalise the smaller member states and the EU institutions. That's a worrying trend. So to summarise, we think that in 2010, the first year of the crisis, Europe was distracted by it. In 2011, the second year, it was diminished by it. Coming now to the 6 main issues that we look at. As you see, multilateral issues in crisis management, the United States, Middle East and North Africa, Russia, wider Europe and China. Overall, another mediocre year for European foreign policy. We gave mediocre scores in 2010. There have also been mediocre scores in 2011. And we, in particular, think that there's a danger of what we call the acquis diplomatique, which in a sense is a sort of a counterpart to the acquis communautaire, except on foreign policy. Not necessarily areas in which competence has been transferred to the EU institutions, but a collection of areas in which the EU collectively, member states collectively pursued their foreign policy interests and promoted their values. This is something that was gradually developing over time. It's still very much incomplete, but we fear now that there's a danger that it's going to be eroded, particularly on China, where, as you see, we gave the lowest score of the 6 issues that we look at. And that fits very much in with the point I made earlier about the shift from being a solution to being a problem. Clearly, that's been felt in the relationship with China, where in 2011, Europe's main priority was to seek Chinese investment, particularly in European sovereign debt. I'll just go very, very quickly through the 6 issues. China, I've already mentioned. Europe's attempt to develop a more strategic approach to China was undermined by the need to seek Chinese investment and member states essentially competing with each other. On Russia, there's been some progress in the last few years on European policy towards Russia, particularly because of greater cooperation between Germany and Poland, who, in a sense, represented the 2 extremes of European views of Russia. And that led to some concrete results, in particular Russian accession to the WTO in 2011. But the return of Putin, in a sense, ends a period of wishful thinking that Russia was going to modernize politically as well as economically. The Middle East and North Africa, as I mentioned, the crisis has constrained our ability to respond to it. Europe had this strategy of money, markets, and mobility, but in each of the 3 cases, the crisis has created what we call a delivery gap, where Europe hasn't been able to deliver on money, on opening markets, and on easing mobility in the way that it might do otherwise. And we think that there's a danger that Europe's missing this historic opportunity to reinvent its relationship with its southern neighborhood. The United States, the big story was Libya in 2011, and in a sense quite an interesting new model of cooperation, this idea of leading from behind, where as the US shifts its focus from the Atlantic to the Pacific, increasingly expects Europeans to take care of their own neighborhood. But on the other hand, the Libya intervention, in a sense, illustrated the limits of European capabilities, military capabilities. We couldn't have done it without the US, particularly we relied on the US for intelligence, electronic jamming, and refueling capabilities. And with the defense budget cuts that I mentioned, there's a big question mark about whether we will even be able to maintain the same level of capabilities that we had in 2011, let alone increase them as the US shifts its attention away, as I mentioned. Fifthly, the wider Europe, which is this area that includes the Western Balkans, the 6 countries that form the Eastern Partnership in Eastern Europe, and Turkey, a kind of a mixed picture. We think that there was some progress in the Western Balkans, less so in the Eastern Partnership, where there's been this trend towards authoritarian retrenchment, and another really bad year for Europe on Turkey. And finally, multilateral issues and crisis management. Again, some surprising successes in the context of the crisis, particularly the deal on carbon emissions that was reached at the Durban Climate Change Summit at the end of last year. But these were overshadowed, these limited achievements were overshadowed really by the shift that I mentioned at the beginning, particularly in institutions like the G20 and the IMF, where Europe is increasingly a problem rather than a solution. I'm going to skip forward to the member state categorization and just end with this. This is a table that shows you the member states that we think led most frequently and the member states that we think slacked most frequently. And if we start with the table on the left of leaders, you'll see that Germany's at the top with France and the UK, and in a sense it's maybe not surprising that the big 3 lead most frequently. But we think that actually it is interesting that Germany is at the top of that list. This is the first time we've done this member state categorization, so we don't really have anything to compare to, but we think intuitively that if we would have done this 5 years ago or 10 years ago, Germany probably wouldn't be at the top of that list because it tended to defer to France and the UK on foreign policy, even though it played an important role economically in the EU. And so it seems as if Germany's role in European foreign policy is in flux. But this doesn't necessarily mean that Germany is now the unquestioned leader of Europe, as some people have been suggesting. People are joking that the answer to the famous Kissinger question about who do I call if I want to speak to Europe, the answer to that question is now call the Chancellery in Berlin. We don't think it's that simple, because if you look at the right-hand table, you'll see that Germany is also in the list of top slackers. And so it raises an interesting question about whether Germany's using its increased weight within the European Union that seems to have arisen from the euro crisis, whether it's using that increased weight in order to pursue Europe's strategic interests as a whole, the interests of Europe as a whole, or whether it's simply pursuing its own national interests, and perhaps that's something we can pick up in the discussion. And finally, just on a final word on the member state categorization, you'll see that after the big three, you have Sweden and then Poland as the next two most frequent leaders. And that, I think, raises an interesting question about the extent to which small or smaller member states can punch above their weight, as it were, in European foreign policy. And we haven't done a systematic analysis of why this is the case, and therefore whether this is likely to continue in future, that, for example, Sweden and Poland are going to continue to lead more frequently than Italy or Spain, which you'll see is not on the list of top leaders at all. There's a number of possible explanations of why that they might lead so frequently. One is that they both have very activist foreign ministers who are prepared to take initiative, but there are also other member states that have similarly activist foreign ministers. I'm thinking particularly of Bulgaria, that aren't able to lead quite so frequently. And that suggests that as well as having a foreign minister who's prepared to take initiative, you also need resources to back it up, whether that's diplomatic resources or economic resources or military resources or whatever. There I think it's quite interesting that Sweden and Poland are two countries that are both outside of the euro. They're also countries that haven't been affected as badly by the euro crisis as some others, as, for example, Italy and Spain. So it raises the question of whether perhaps Spain's failure really to lead more frequently on European foreign policy in 2011 has economic roots. Nacho wrote in a paper about Spain last year that its dire economic situation has ejected it from its seat at Europe's leadership table. I'd be interested to hear other people's views about whether that's the case and whether that will continue.